Hey, this is John Reed on the last day of Workday Rising. My Vegas residency is just about to end. I've got a special guest treat for y'all today because it's not going to be the southern drawl of Brian Summer today. He's off parts unknown. I got Pete Tiliakos. How you doing?
Yeah, good, sir. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here, man. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, it's cool because how you get on my podcast, in case listeners don't know, you just need to have some strong opinions and ask bothersome questions.
Yeah.
And I've seen you do that on a number of occasions. You have angles on the future of work. In fact, it says you're on your LinkedIn profile, it says you're a futurist. I usually don't get along with futurists, so this could be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
But you also spent a lot of time drilling in on payroll specifically. And actually, for those who think that sounds boring, it's actually a really big friggin' deal. And companies and vendors really struggle with how to make sense of that, especially in the modern landscape that we're dealing with now, where you can't really afford to have these siloed legacy data centers. So you got a lot of work to do then.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. No, it's a good point. I appreciate you pointing that out. Look, I'm a former practitioner turned consultant turned analyst, right? And I study this market but have lived it, right? Walked a mile in the shoes of the leaders that are out there. And you're right. I just came off stage with one of the CHROs for one of the vendors out there, and we were talking about just all that the CHRO is facing right now. And certainly, with talent being not infinite anymore, right? Not necessarily right here in your back pocket. Companies are finding, or in your backyard, companies are finding themselves probably at a younger maturity stage in places that they didn't expect. And now they've got a global workforce, and that's a whole other game, right? When you're talking about that. So yeah, lot going on here.
And I think the other really fascinating thing about your area of focus, because I tend to look at a pretty broad spectrum of things. Future of work is like part of it. I spent a lot of time on AI, but I think what's really fascinating about AI and HR in general is that you have kind of the more kind of basic administrivia of making the HR manager's life maybe a little bit better. But then you have a lot of high stakes stuff around recruitment, talent, all this kind of stuff where you can get yourself in a lot of trouble with the EU AI pretty soon, or basically just screw stuff up in ways that are harmful to people. And so it really brings the issues to a head, I think, around like what kind of AI future are we going to have? Right. And so it's an interesting area that you have staked out for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, you're right on all those things. I think there's a lot of curiosity for how AI can help us, but all that, also that guarded nature of like, hey, this is our people, this is our data, this is, we could make a bad decision. We could, and I was just asking this, in that conversation with the CHRO is like, are these organizations able to digest all this fast enough and move quick enough and make these decisions quick enough? And I think that it's going to bring itself to a head here with AI really proliferating very quickly. Again, so much excitement, but also we need some cautious guardrails around it, right?
I think it's also really interesting from a worker vantage point because you have this, I got into this a little bit with Workday, and actually my post on their finance course, I brought up this I criticized, it's a great course, but I brought up a criticism around sort of a focus on productivity as a metric, which was a big topic of debate this week. And part of it is we think from a worker's perspective, like, I don't want to lose my job to this technology. So, these productivity metrics, it sounds so great to managers. Maybe to me, it just stresses me out that I'm kind of working harder. Yeah. And I think that's what's so fascinating about all this sort of data exhaust that's required for these systems is this could either make my workplace better and my manager will listen to me and do stuff in a more humane way, or I feel like I'm surveilled in a whole new way.
There you go. Yeah.
So it's just, I think you're in a fantastic place to kind of like help companies figure out how to navigate that, and vendors as well, right? In terms of like how to talk about this in a way that it feels empowering to people and doesn't feel like, this is a mechanistic technology that's going to come
Big brother, right? Yeah. No, agreed. And you bring up a good point. I mean, I think there's, we hear a lot more now about the frontline worker, right? I think like the last Rising, that was a big emphasis. It still is. But I think they brought out a lot of solutions to help with that. And I think you have to think about that from the perspective of there's a lot more HR happening on the front line by the manager. It's not HR coaching and counseling and, making sure people are, meeting the goals that they have for themselves, but for the company. So Yeah, it's almost like if you're a leader now and you have direct reports, you're in HR too. You know what I mean? In some ways, and you're the first line of defense for that engagement. So yeah, a lot to think about right now.
So as you and I were sitting here, we've commandeered an empty room and hopefully won't be interrupted, which is always like the suspenseful part. But we're on sort of officially like day 2 of the full days, and we're just about to wrap. So this has given you an opportunity to kind of come in for a couple of days here.
Yep.
And, we've had some analyst sessions, and then you've also, I'm sure, gone to some general sessions and talk with customers. So tell a listener a little bit about like what was on your mind coming into the show in terms of some of the questions you wanted to get addressed. And then let's kind of look at how far we got with those in the last couple of days.
Yeah, I think for me coming into this, I was really curious. Like, someone said to me this week, and I can't remember who it was. It wasn't an analyst, actually. They said, I feel like Workday's more focused than ever. And I was like, that's a great observation. I think we all kind of came away with some of that from the Innovation Summit back in the spring, right? That the group was, the leaders seemed more relaxed and aligned and knew where they were headed, knew who they were, knew where they were headed. So yeah, for me, it was coming in this time was, I think last year it was a lot of theory around this, but now this year we're seeing the agents, we're seeing the use cases, we're seeing the industry accelerators. A lot of emphasis has been put on that AI now to bring it to life and start actionabilizing that between HR and finance. So it's coming to life, right? And now it's up to the organizations to begin to digest and as you point out, like start thinking about how they can make that impact, for their unique use cases. And when you walk around, I think there's a tone of cautious optimism, like you say, like a lot of excitement for what AI can do, but also we got to be careful because what about our culture? What about our people's data? What about, and I think there's a lot of, I think when you listen to organizations that are out there deploying it, a lot of them have already deployed it on their front end with their partner, or with their product or their customer. Right. So they've failed fast and learned there. And now they're starting to say, hey, how can we make this a reality for our employees, right? Because they deserve the same experience as our customers, and we've learned. So yeah, I think there's a lot of folks that are excited about things, but again, as you point out, they have to take that cautious digestion of what is it going to mean for our culture, our organizations, that sort of thing. So yeah.
And I know you've had a long dialogue with Workday around payroll, and one of the things about payroll that I like is a topic. Some people may say, oh, it's a little bit bland, but I think to me, what's fascinating about it is it puts you right in the nexus of localization, globalization. Like, good luck exporting your North America, your American payroll rules to any other, geography. And so a company like Workday that got a start in North America and then gets global, faces a lot of interesting challenges around the payroll aspect. And So how have you seen this evolving, and then where are we at now?
Yeah, well, look, I think that payroll has always been incredibly important, but I think it's been somewhat, I don't know if marginalized is the word, but it's just sort of been like an afterthought. It's like electricity. If you go over and flip the light switch and the lights come on, you're not going to, it's like in my house, the Wi-Fi goes out. My kids are like, Dad, what, my 20 somethings, but it's the same thing with payroll. Like you don't hear anything unless somebody doesn't flip, the lights doesn't come on, right? And so I think what happens in that is employers have, and especially the C-suite, have looked at payroll as a cost center, right? And you could argue that, you could easily argue that. And you could say, well, but at the same time, what I think they're finding out is that it's a massive organizational agility enabler, right? Or not. So McLaren is out on the floor, right? There's a McLaren, I don't know if you got to go over there and check it out. There's a great simulator out there. McLaren is a customer that gave a great talk.
Right. Yeah.
Think of an organization today as a race car, right? You might have all the best technology. You've got the best talent, right? You've got the best pit crew. So you got all the best people. You've got all the best intentions. You're doing all the right things. You got core HR. You've got finance, whatever. But let's suppose that you didn't transform payroll in all of that. Well, your race car is now sitting on cheap tires, and you're not going to pivot around the corner and win if you can't scale and expand and be resilient. And the reality of it is that now, or not now, always, when you have something go on in your life, right? Who's the first place you call if you're an employee? It's generally payroll, right? So the data set that payroll is sitting on is incredibly accurate possibly the most accurate in the organization, incredibly rich in insights. And yet the organizations have commonly overlooked it, right? And not really thought of payroll as, hey, someone we ought to have at the table in our discussions around this new strategic thing that we're doing, right? Payroll it's good enough if it can limp along. Hey, you're getting the checks out the door. What do you need innovation for, right? And I think what companies have come around to the realization of is that payroll is as essential to the HR experience as it is to the business outcomes. And it's either a strategic enabler or it's not. And those that can't pivot and handle are going to be those that aren't going to be able to scale. They aren't going to remain agile. And sadly, they're missing out on the opportunity to take all that great data and pair it with their business data, their operational data, maybe some external data, HR data, finance data, and now have this picture that gives them the ability to see around the next corner and maybe predict, right? I think we heard McLaren use that same analogy of, now with Workday, I'm able to see around the next corner. And I think that's what payroll can offer. But again, it has to be in a modernized state where it can handle for what you're trying to do. And if that's mergers and acquisitions or look,
getting paid daily, for example, is another interesting.
That's a whole flexibility conversation, right? About the employee experience, right? We want to come to work and have our own experience, right? Whether that's, the time I work, where I work, how I'm paid, all of that sort of thing. But I think that organizations have come to the realization now, like I said, that payroll has to be modernized in line with everything else. And let's remember, you could argue the chicken or I say it's payroll's chicken or egg moment, like finance or HR, doesn't really matter. They got to work with both. They've got to integrate with both. And if it's the largest hit to the P&L, right? It's the largest business expense in the organization, labor. That's a big deal for me if I'm the CFO, right? So it's as important to me as it is maybe the CHRO for that employee experience and all the great things that payroll does. But I think what I'm really in my research and really seeing organizations realize is payroll is an enabler to strategy or a detractor, and you can decide, right? And if you're dragging around on these, you've got all this great technology and insights and talent and everything, and you've laid it on top of bad tires, it's gonna be a problem, right? If you pay people wrong, all that stuff goes out the window, right? Goodbye. Doesn't matter how much HCM, human capital management strategy that you employed and all the great intentions you had. The trust is gone now with that worker, and we could go on and on, right? But I think that's what the C-suite ought to be thinking is you looking at payroll as another strategic enabler for them, right? And a partner in the business to advise them along their path, right? They're compliance experts, and they know generally, when I managed payroll at the Walt Disney Company, I often knew more about HR's processes than HR did because I had to follow that flow back and forth up and down the stream. And I think payroll has been overlooked for that reason and the other reasons that I've pointed out. And it's so much more now than just paychecks, right? It really is data and insights and the ability to exercise whatever strategy you're trying to, achieve. So
I think what you just said kind of makes me think about, Workday when it was founded 20 years ago or so. There was a modern SaaS oriented approach at that time, but like any SaaS company, markets do change, right? And so Workday has to go through a modernization process also. And so I think about the payroll challenge under two sort of areas. One is modernization, which is kind of what you just described.
Yep.
If you get that done, then applying AI to that conversation really makes sense.
Oh yeah.
If you don't have that done, then forget about having a really effective AI conversation. So there's that. But then there's also the globalization, localization conversation, which is a little bit different because you can't just go to an AI and say, please globalize my payroll for me.
Right.
So I think you got a little bit of clarity you were saying around some of that stuff you talked about before you and I started taping around the marketplace options and stuff. So what are you seeing? You said you see some progress there?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe go back and have maybe a little short history lesson, if you will. So do you remember this last year? We were on stage. They gave Workday always gives a kind of like a lifetime achievement sort of customer award, right? Like one of their longer standing, innovative customers. And they had, I think, their fourth or third customer on the stage last year. And do you remember Neil saying he was the gentleman who convinced me that we needed to have payroll in Workday? They didn't start out wanting to put payroll in there, right? They thought, let's leave it up to the payroll guys. And I think that's a really interesting starting point where Workday was maybe pulled towards something that, is important, but maybe at the time it wasn't the emphasis that it has now, right? And so I think, you come along with that, and then of course, Workday got really out in front of a lot of the talent stuff, and they really went hard. Obviously, core HR at the beginning, and all the the operational stuff. But I think they went really hard on talent for a while and kind of neglected the blocking and tackling, if you will, right? That would need to set up those great home run moments over on the talent side. And I think what happened was COVID obviously thrust us into a world where remote work became incredibly important, right? Incredibly viable for what we were dealing with, and I think a peek into what the future was going to be. All right. And now I think you've got employers who are, right? Everyone is struggling for talent in every sector, in every space. Like there's so many drivers of that. Now you have to get talent wherever it is, and you've got to open up multiple channels of opportunity to attach yourself to that talent. And that could be contingent skills, that could be skills in some other location, that could be whatever. You go back to the productivity thing. It used to be you threw bodies at a situation and linearly you got more productivity. That's not the case, right? Now you need skills, the right skills at the right time. And so I think what you have is the convergence of this sort of globalized nature of talent, right? The globalized nature of business with all of the technology we have. But HR and payroll didn't necessarily keep up with that. So what was happening is everyone, you mentioned the deep localization. Look, you can have the payroll technology, you can have the engine, you can have all of that, but like you still often have to have boots on the ground to go and exercise and finalize those last mile things, the compliance that locally. So for example, I do some work with a vendor in Africa. And one of the things I noticed is in some places in Africa, you have to come down to the local office of the legislation or whatever, the local, government, and turn in your reports with wet ink. Like there's no fax, there's no API. Like, how do you do that? That's not technology, right? And someday we'll get there with those sort of things. But the point is, those localizations are compounded when you start to go. I mean, US is its own bear, right? With 16,000 plus entities here when you think of all our states and locals. But when you start going and taking that template of the US and trying to do payroll in other places, it doesn't fit because it's different and there's different local requirements. And you're right. That I think has created that's where the complexity and the difficulty in achieving, air quotes, a global payroll has been really, really hard. And the tech just wasn't there to help with that. And now I think we're getting there. So I'm not sure if that's, I might've given you
that makes sense
there, but I think in a roundabout way, Workday has caught up to that, and a little bit, they were catching up a little bit. I think they knew that. They've brought forward, more of their, a few more engines, right? We've got Ireland coming live, I think next year. We saw Australia come up. So they've got like 5 countries, the big countries they can handle, UK, Canada, US, but there was gaps in their ability to go and target multinational organizations. They had this great marketplace of partners, but there just wasn't a lot of clarity around it. And I think they've brought a lot of clarity around that now with the Global Payroll Connect and the Global Payroll Hub. And they've really said, look, we're going to focus on the experience and the data and the control point of global payroll, but we're going to leave all of that localization and orchestration and all the hard stuff to the experts. And that's our partners. And they've got a fantastic stalwart set of marquee partners. And then I think they've taken that a step further now and clarified it and said, look, we're not necessarily going to try to build every engine in the world and everything that we need for every country. We're going to lean on those partners, and they're looking towards this cohort of initial co-innovators to help them bring that to market. So for example, we saw the Strata, formerly Alight, formerly NGA HR. They've been rebranded a few times, spun off and bought by different folks. Now we've got an actual partner-enabled Workday payroll by Strata, right? That is going to give them that ability to bring them the engines and the capability and the managed services on the ground to handle those countries where Workday doesn't necessarily want to build a calc engine, but they do need to compete. So Germany, right? Or Belgium or Netherlands or any of these, kind of high volume areas where they need to go head to head with their peers. And in order to do that, payroll's got to be a part of that. And I think they're leaning on those partners and saying, let's let these experts come in here and complement. We'll focus on what we do best. You focus on what you do best, and let's meet in the middle for our customer. And I think that's what you've seen now with the Global Payroll Connect. And there's still that, Workday's always given their customers options. There's still that options, but they're being a little more prescriptive now with, how to go to market with some of these things. And I think they're solving. And remember, I'm going off on another tangent here, but like some of their competitors, many of their competitors, right? Like the Dayforces, the UKGs, they offer services with their software, right? And that's a common sort of expectation where Workday has said, we're going to stay out of services and we're going to let our partners handle that. And that's where they hand that off. So a lot of clarity. I think in short, a lot of clarity around global payroll now. Yeah.
I think one really interesting thing about Workday is that they tend to be very deliberate and then they kind of like push fast once they kind of get the basics in place. So it can make you kind of impatient for a while and then you have to rethink your assumptions. And like one example of that was like about, I don't know, like maybe 5-7 years ago when people asked me about Workday, I said my biggest criticism of the platform is it feels too insular to me because I'm very much like a believer in like that. Stop talking about vanilla SaaS and start talking about creating a platform where your partners can really push the envelope with industry solutions, let customers build add-ons and change from this whole like that it's not just about custom on-premise shit versus like vanilla SaaS, like create a really different kind of platform. And finally they did with Extend. Yeah. And in fact, now I give them a hard time for not featuring it enough because so much cool stuff is happening. Like they'll mention casually, like, Target built 10 apps on Extend, which is kind of a big deal. But you hear these stories all the time. Like, I think I was just in a session where one of their health customers built this big vaccine app on Extend during the pandemic. They did it in a matter of a few days, but they're still using this kind of stuff. And so I think the same is kind of true for the parallels to payroll are right there, like, using a platform like that to engage their partners and saying like, they don't have to go to every country if they do this right. Right. Yeah. And it's just a different mentality. And so it's interesting because Workday does have a lot of kind of a deliberate play. You see that with their public cloud adoption where I don't think I'm allowed to say the number yet because my buddy Holger Mueller is still getting...
I think that's NDA.
But he's still getting permission. I told him, once you tweet it, I'm going to share it. Yeah. But basically, they've like tripled their public cloud like adoption of running on Workday from a number of months ago. So it's like it goes from a start to an accelerant. And then the AI strategy is very, very similar where like a lot of the sort of quote unquote features and new bots and stuff are still forthcoming as far as generative AI is concerned, but they've made a whole lot of progress on the architecture and the platform, which they announced under the Illuminate sort of banner this week. Yep. But like even since we met with them this spring, for example, I've noticed one of the stories I'm going to write about a little bit is they've dramatically downshifted their reliance on external large language models, even from 6 months ago, which is a pretty big deal in terms of just making it that much easier to like protect customer data at all times because they don't really, from what I can tell from hearing from Shane Luke, who runs AI, they're not even really, the only times they're really using external models right now, from what he says, is not even for day-to-day Gen AI stuff for customers. It's for their own experiments is when they like using the external providers. So like this is a big change. And so the sophistication by which they talk about how they use, basically train smaller models out of larger ones and all of the things that they've done there. I've written about this the last couple of days on Diginom if you want to check it out. But the point being like a lot of deliberate moves. Yeah. And then I think the next phase you'll see is a whole lot of, agents, apps, whatever, like, but that's always how they seem to roll, so you have to keep that in mind with them where like you can get a little bit like they're moving slower and then they tend to pick up speed and they're like, we want to do this responsibly. And that's what they said about Extend too. The same thing they're saying about AI in a way is like, we wanted to do this responsibly. The same thing they said with Extend is like, we had a whole lot of things we wanted to make sure we got right about that. So I could criticize them for being a little slow on it, but the point is once they do it, then they start moving faster. So
agreed. Yeah, I mean, I think
yeah.
Workday's, you're right, deliberate is a good word. I think they're very, I wouldn't say cautious, but they do want to get it right from the beginning. And I would say that I feel like Workday, because I do a lot of work with a lot of the global payroll providers, a lot of different firms in that space. And I've helped facilitate some conversations of getting some of those partnerships off the ground. I think Workday is really hitting a stride with its partners right now. And I think it's perfectly timed because let's face it, their partners are going to be the path. Like you just said, they can't build it all, right? No one can build everything. They know what they're good at. They know what they're not. They know where they should place their bets on, ventures and other things to help them. But they're leaning on their partners. And I think, it's going to be so essential for their international growth and adoption. It's going to be essential for the sector, right? I was really excited to see some of those sector accelerators, industry accelerators, as they're calling them. So I think all of that is going to be where the partners can really shine and bring forward some of these things. And don't forget the microservices extensibility. It's even empowering the customers to build their own little, solutions and not have to have IT involved in all that. So yeah, I love that. It's some great, like the Target story was a really great story. I think they were using it for rewards and some other things too. So yeah, very cool.
So did you have any moments the last couple of days that really stand out in terms of like debates or discussions, hot topics? Was there anything that like really grabbed you?
I'll tell you what I'm really excited about. I'm really excited about Venly. Venly is their, equivalent to Fieldglass for SAP, right, or maybe I'm trying to think of another vendor. But so you're thinking about your contingent workforce, your VMS, your vendor management solution. Right? You think about the data. There's plenty of data out there. You can go look at the World Economic Forum, Mercer. Everybody's got data on the fact that contingents are really the future of talent, right? And for many of the reasons we talked about, skills acquisition, right? We've got the creator economy giving people, younger people especially, just more pathways to getting into the workforce and being able to do different things. So I think that VMS capability is really, really essential right now, especially for the enterprise. And what I'm loving about it is that I think it's a win for Workday's clients because they're going to need to manage contingent workers, right? They're going to need to manage, and I don't know if you've ever been a consultant in a big organization. It's a crappy experience if you're this contract worker, right? And if I'm a manager, I need visibility into all of my workers, my employee and workforce, whether they're full-time, contingent, temporary, contingent, long-term, some sort of whatever, right? I need visibility of all of that. And I need the ability to curate a direct sort of talent pool. I'm excited about that. And I think with them and that's another, payroll is a really big, I wrote about this last year. Payroll and I'd say Venly are going to be essential, connectors for HR and the finance dual adoption use case. So if you're going to get more Workday shops, if you will, right, those that are going to kind of pry their partners out of their hands, right, for finance and HR, you're going to have to hit on these things. And I think Venly is another step forward. Bringing that forward is going to be another way for them to weave and have a great story for the CFO and the CHRO, because that solution and that challenge, or that topic of contingent workers is going to straddle both the HR side and the finance side. And I think what also got me excited is, number one, they're bringing HiredScore, the talent, intelligence acquisition they made, which is brilliant, into that, which is going to help with, hey, do I hire a contingent worker right now? Should I hire a full-time? Should I promote John? Should I, what is the best path to solving this talent need? So I think that's huge. And then of course, I love and I'm going to screw up the name. Is it Evasort? Evasort. Sorry, the
document
CLM
intelligent acquisition that they made.
Right. It's like what do they call it? Contract lifecycle management solution.
Yeah.
And think about that, right? It's beautiful for your contingent experience, right? Between finance and HR, trying to sort the legalities of you getting contracted and coming on, and its ability to move unstructured data and give insights to contractual information. I think that was a beautiful play. That was a little quiet little thing that happened this week, this acquisition, that I think is going to be more than a fold. And I think it's really going to be a connector for a couple of different things there. So yeah, I'm excited about Venly.
So yeah, I want to follow up with Venly in a sec real quick, but the acquisition was interesting because readers, you can check out my piece on Workday's financial course for machine learning and AI, which I also kind of tied into the evolution of the finance leader. And one thing that came up both in the sessions that I attended and also in a customer discussion with a chief accounting officer at DataStax was this whole notion of that so much of what they need for, you talk about like the kind of data that they're going to really apply with AI is in documents. And and what a pain in the ass, and it's the same is true for HR, right? But what a pain in the ass it has historically been to try to get the right information out of these documents. And so there's definitely, like, I think an excitement from people around what can be done there to speed that up and make that easier, because, you know, your AI is really only as smart as what you put into it. And so so we're going to hear a lot more about this whole concept of document intelligence and what this means.
Think so. I agree. It's a crummy process. Like, I think that's one of the things that I'd love to see more of in the future from all the vendors in the HCM space, is really starting to think about these, what I call it orchestration, but you know, you think about like things that are not transacted in finance or HR, but maybe housed in something else. So let me give you an example. Leave administration, right? It's a pain in the ass, a horrible process, a horrible experience for most people. HR does their thing in the system, but then, you know, sending someone off on a leave can, depending upon policy and type of organization, can trigger things like, do they get to keep their company car? Do they get to keep building access? Do we need to backfill them while they're gone? You know, there's a lot of things that sometimes happen in HR, but there's a lot that doesn't. And then, like, how do you orchestrate all that so that the employee doesn't feel this really crummy, choppy experience? And I think something like Evisort is a step in that direction, right? Because we've all been a contractor maybe before, right? You've done contracting with vendors, I'm sure. It's not the best experience when you're dealing with this very rigid procurement group, and maybe you're an employee. Like, you're not a vendor, right? You're just a guy trying to, you know, bring your skill to the table and help with whatever project the customer's on.
Yeah.
To treat you like a vendor, it's not a great experience. So just connecting the dots on things, I think, and making use cases that are touching one area of the business, but maybe belong somewhere else, and it's not in the HR system and it's not in the finance system. I think that's where we've got to get some orchestration between the two. And that's what I hope AI, you know, generative is going to do. And maybe in some ways, like, I think a good example might be the new announcement with Salesforce and Workday, right? Like, I think that's a technology where there's a lot of things going on that are not HR in the business that people are using Salesforce for. And there's going to be an opportunity for that integration and orchestration between the two to help bring that experience to another level. So I think Workday's thinking about it, certainly, and obviously starting to make strides that way.
Yeah, and that's going to be a big topic to watch as far as like the kind of partnerships that Workday and Salesforce are forming, because it's going to be this whole thing around, you know, I'm about to write a piece on why AI agents are BS, but it's a little tongue in cheek because I think they are going to be useful. But one of the things is that when you tell an agent that you want it to complete some task, you don't want to hear that, well, I can't do that because some of that's in Salesforce and some of that's in Workday.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't matter to me. Yeah.
I don't want to hear that.
I'm just trying to get to the end result. Yeah.
So it's going to be really interesting to see how well these companies do with these kinds of agent to agent sort of interactions, and will this sort of solve some of the so-called headaches around integration that have been such a bugaboo. So that's going to be an interesting story to watch going forward. But they set the table there for high expectations. So we'll see if they can deliver on that. I wanted to ask you one more quick thing about Venly, because I did a piece on Venly a couple of years ago, and I haven't tracked them too closely, but I really did like their approach to the contingent workforce. And what I was kind of waiting to hear more on, and I've been told that it's been happening, is just more the integration. Because to me, like, it's not, I may be wrong, but I don't think about contingent workforce over here and like full-time employees over here. I think about the future work in a very like fluid kind of way. And so what I'm interested in is how it all sort of flows across. Like, I want to see how Venly kind of becomes much more fluid with whatever the customer is using within Workday to manage. Because it's like, oh, I'm going to hire this contractor. They're going to go full-time. This person's going to go, you know, be a gig worker. Like, all this kind of change is going to happen. This person's juggling 3 positions. Like, I want Workday and Venly to be able to solve those problems with me without like having to go to different UIs or different.
Totally.
I mean, have you gotten a sense of the progress around that?
I asked that. I said, what is the experience if I'm a Venly user and I'm a manager or a leader in procurement or HR? And what is it like if I'm an employee? And for the employee, it's largely the same as an employee they're using the app, they're using the same sort of functionality in the HCM. Whereas your procurement and your HR and your back end are more using the Venly. But Venly is sort of the place where it's all being coordinated out of, right? So and I even found out there's a light time tracking or project kind of time tracking in Venly as well. So there are certain things that overlap a little bit, but largely the employee experience, if you will, is going to be delivered through the HCM. And the Venly is actually the solution more for the practitioner side, who's managing a direct talent pool and workforce and that sort of thing. Talent pool. Sorry. So I kind of poked on that as well. And again, I think that you're seeing more integration with things like HiredScore. You're going to see Evasort come into play. So I think Workday is going to continue to push on that solution. And it sounds like, I can't say the numbers, but the growth is really, really impressive. I talked to 2 customers. Let me give you an example, John. I talked to a customer earlier, 100,000 employees and another 30,000 contingent, right?
There you go. Yeah.
I had another one, 27,000, I think it was employees, like 40,000 contingent. But that's not active at any one time. They're constantly turning around.
Yeah.
More, so, and if that balance keeps going up, I mean, Venly could become really a pivotal piece of tech. I mean, literally, I talked to one customer. They're all in on Workday. They have everything, and that's the one thing they were here with their eye on. And they were the 30% of their workforce being contingent. It's really a big deal for them. And it sounds like they're in 120 countries. Venly is it sounds like mostly localized to most of the majors, and more are coming. So yeah, I think you're going to see that solution really. I keep an eye there. I really
something to watch. I mean, HR tech vendors hate it when I say things like this, but I feel like the workforce has changed a lot faster than they have, and it's going to be interesting to see if they can catch up with us because our workforce has really changed. So.
And to some extent, I think Workday and their peers have a responsibility to sort of define it with this tech, right? Or at least give you the tools to let you define it as an employer, and maybe you should define it as an employer. That's probably up for debate, but I mean, I think just like in the same way that Apple is changing and kind of dictating the way the mobile experience it was, or whatever, or any of their peers, I think it's the same thing for the HCM providers, right? They need to be setting planting the flag and saying this is the direction based on our thought leadership as experts in this space that we believe you ought to be heading, and then it's up to you to actionabilize that in your organization and turn that into an enabler for what we're trying to do.
So I want to wrap in a couple minutes, but just for our listeners, in terms of my hot topics to answer my own question, a couple of the big ones were the productivity debate and why I don't think AI should be framed around productivity. And I kind of took a little bit of a criticism towards Workday around that and how it was framed in a particular course, but that's partially because they featured the work of a very optimistic person who's an expert, I will say, who's like, oh, Gen AI is going to increase productivity by 3% or whatever. And I was trying to point out that historically, 3% would be a huge thing that would surpass anything we've achieved with mobile phones or any kind of AI to date. So it would be a big deal if it happens. So anyway, I don't really like the productivity framing around AI. I think we need to talk more about making people's lives better, making their work better, and not feeling like bringing the hammer down and creating this mechanistic dystopian workforce of the future. So that's been a great discussion. And actually, Workday has some really, really good content on that. So I think Workday does a good job on those themes. I was just picking a couple times where I felt like they had framed it more in a way that I would not. So that was a really good discussion. I'm glad that Workday people were really open to having that discussion. And then today I asked during exec Q&A about a PR email I received about a company called Klarna, a fintech company that has gotten a lot of press for itself because they're ripping out Workday and Salesforce and replacing with AI.
I saw that.
Which I think is a bunch of bunk. I said during the question to the Workday executive team that I would love to send a robot to future conferences too. I'm not sure if that's incredibly realistic though, because I'd just like to hang out at home in my money slippers and let my robot do all the hard work. And so they're going to build this platform of the future with AI. I think that's a total overreach, but I will say this: it provokes a really fascinating conversation about the future of software and technology. And so I think the more interesting thing is not whether they can do it or not, because certain companies that have specialist technologists are going to be able to do some really interesting things that the average customer in like healthcare or retail won't have time or energy, inclination to do. But it's a great conversation. So I will be writing about that. That's not been published yet.
And I haven't read totally into that Klarna thing. I heard about it, but I haven't dug into it a lot. So I'm interested to see where that goes.
At the same time they did that, they're cutting
a lot of questions.
At the same time they did that, they're cutting 50% of their workforce. And so, like I said, I'm a little worried about like this sort of dystopian, like a handful of people inside of a walled garden somewhere have created this amazing, technology, but we don't actually have any humans around working anymore. So it is really interesting. And, but one of the things, that I think came up around that's fascinating too is, does your transactional system really become a commodity layer, which I think it does.
It could, yeah.
And so, what do the transactional vendors do about that? And of course, they're all trying to do something about that, and they have been for a while. This is not something new. They kind of got the writing on the wall quite some time ago, I think, when they realized that a lot of analytics and planning vendors have better relations with the C-suite based on their data than they did. So this is not something new, but it's a fascinating conversation, and that will be continued.
Yeah,
so
totally.
So going forward, is there anything you're going to be watching, like from the days here, or something you're going to be tracking going forward?
Yeah, I definitely want to I'm definitely staying very close to the Vinley stuff. I'm a big fan of that. I'm also really I'm obviously going to stay very close to this global payroll developments, how GPC is going to go on. I'd love to talk to some customers that begin to use the Strata SKU and that sort of thing. And don't forget, right? There's a lot of there's other great providers in that don't actually have SKUs, but are fantastic part of that initial cohort. So like Payslip, for example, or Safeguard or CloudPay, all long-term firms that have been in these walls as integrated partners, delivering payroll for many of these customers. It's going to be interesting to see I'll be interested to see what the adoption is and where customers lean. Right? Are they leaning into that cohort? Are they going with more of a choice option? But I'll be keeping close to that. I think there's, it's gonna evolve, right? They're evolving their messaging. I think they sharpened it here because they announced this they announced it previously to us, but it hit the presses, I think, in August-ish when GPC came out. So I'll be keeping close eye on that. The other thing I'm really intrigued about, we didn't really get an update here, but this is a huge part of of Workday's TAM, and I think this is really, really critical. And that is, if you guys noticed, they made an announcement last year about a new go-to-market with Insperity, one of the PEOs. Now, the PEO industry is largely a all-in HR service that allows you to transfer risk in the United States. It's primarily a U.S. sort of based concept. We now have global EOR, which is similar but different, outside the U.S. But the PEO industry is very close with that small business owner, right, and helping them get off the ground with the right set of HR out of the gate, the right insurances, work comp, all that sort of thing. Insperity has said, look, we're going to anchor ourselves to Workday exclusively. So they're more or less leaning on Workday as both a stopgap to the customers that they're losing when they're out maturing the PEO model. Either it gets too expensive or it doesn't offer enough technology. But I think what I think Workday gains here is the ability to go into a market that they haven't really been that successful at, right? The knock has been it's expensive, right? Too expensive, maybe cost prohibitive, maybe too much enterprise grade technology for the down market. So I think Insperity is stepping up and saying, hey, we're betting our legacy on Workday. They've got an exclusivity, I think, for 5 years. So they're going all in on Workday. I think it's like 150 million. I wrote an article, I can't remember, but it was, 150 million or so bet. But I think what's got to happen is the two of them are going to have to figure out PEO is an expensive service model. Workday is unapologetically higher end price. That's a very, very expensive stack for a small buyer. Or is that small mid-market buyer going to go for that? And that's what I think remains to be seen, that Insperity is going to have to become a really great economy of scale for Workday down market and give them that sort of, the go-to SI for the SMB. And this could be an opportunity for Workday to open up a really interesting TAM for themselves where maybe some of your down market players have been dominating the pays, as we'll call them. In the US here, the Paycoms, the Paylocities, these guys. So I'm keeping an eye on that. We didn't get an update here on this. I'm going to try to grab it at HR Tech next week. We've got some meetings on it, but that's something to keep your eye on, because that's an interesting market that Workday is now pushing into, that they are really bringing a machine gun to a, you know what I mean, to a knife fight. It's like these other guys have these other smaller payroll oriented originally firms. Like I said, I call them a pays, just haven't necessarily developed the enterprise grade level capabilities of a Workday. Now they've caught up their HCMs. They're very robust for what they're doing. But I think Workday is stepping into an arena now where they can be the 500-pound gorilla if they can make it a viable price point for right? And they've got to ready the product as well. I mean, PEO is a different business model. It requires different, there's some different nuances you have to provide. Like, for example, certified payroll. When you're doing government contract payroll, you have to have, certain labor rates you use for that. You have to break it down by job code, and it's very complicated. That's not in Workday right now. So they've got to ready that in order for Insperity to be successful here. But I think next year we're going to hear a lot more about this going forward. And this is something to watch, because I think this is Workday's entrance into that small market and cracking that group. They haven't really, they did start there in a way, right? They had some small clients in the beginning, but I think they've really outgrown right now, 60% of the Fortune 500. So, saturated probably. Cloud HR is probably saturated at that size. They've got to start looking at these mid-market firms that are ready for transformation too. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that was an interesting side note, because you and I were part of a group of analysts at the Workday Innovation gathering this spring.
Yeah.
And I had an analyst say to me earlier today that they felt like they lost track a little bit of the thread on the SMB part of the discussion that we were having this spring. So it'll be interesting to watch that, because Workday has some interesting down market options to deal with, and they have a lot of capabilities to offer, but there's a lot of questions, I think, around price and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how they fare.
Go back to what you said earlier about Workday kind of moving cautiously and then being very deliberate once they do. I think this is that, right? I think, I wouldn't say that they're still figuring it out, but I'm sure they're still fine tuning what the go-to-market is going to look like, how they're going to operate together. And I know those talks are already well underway. And both organizations are really excited about this. I know Insperity really is. And I think it's a bigger win probably for Workday than it might be for their partner, because the partner, right, has a limited, maybe group that they can go after, whereas Workday now is kind of open now to anybody that's an SMB that might want to be, if they want to associate through the Insperity brand, who has tremendous reputation, one of the biggest PEOs in the nation, right up there with ADP Total Source, and I guess it would be TriNet, right? Would be the other big 3 or 4. So yeah, I think this is really, really interesting. So this is one I'm going to definitely keep an eye on, and I hope to see that. I expect Workday is going to open up a nice little TAM here that they can target. So yeah, at least that mature buyer down market,
Well, we're not out of topics, but we are at a time though, because I'm running on fumes, and
it's been a long week, a few days. Yeah,
I got to crank out another article tonight if I can. So, but thanks. This was an excellent conversation, and thanks for bringing the knowledge. It was really good to talk with you.
Appreciate you having me, man. I'm a big fan, and love it, man. So thank you.
Cool. All right, to be continued. Thanks all.